Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dominik Deffner. So Dominik is a computational behavioral scientist with a background in psychology, evolutionary biology, and statistics. In 2016, he got his Bachelor's of Science in Psychology at Philipps University Marburg. He did his master's in St. Andrews at their evolutionary and comparative psychology program. And in 2021, he completed his PhD with Richard McElreath at the Max Planck for Evolutionary Anthropology up in Leipzig. After that, he got a postdoc at the Science of Intelligence Excellence Cluster up in Berlin. And is it this week, this Wednesday? He's about to start a tenure track professorship at Philipps University Marburg. His research combines theoretical and empirical approaches to better understand how individuals, groups, and populations adapt to changing and uncertain environments. And he uses a combination of simulations and also naturalistic group experiments to study how culture and other collective behavioral dynamics emerge. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dominik.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the very nice introduction and for inviting me here. So we actually met in the very early days of our PhDs, which is already 6-7 years ago almost. But I'm always very glad to be here. So I'm starting an assistant professorship in Marburg, so it's full circle for me. The last couple of months, I've been enjoying my life a bit more between postdoc and assistant professorship, so it's my first academic talk in quite a while. I feel a bit rusty, but I hope it will still be entertaining. I will talk about different ways how we can apply computational models to better understand decision making in more naturalistic collectives, and by that understand collective outcomes from a bottom-up way based on understanding individual level cognition. And as you can tell from the different pictures here, it will be quite a tour, both methodologically but also geographically. So we all know that humans are immensely adaptable animals. So with almost the same genes and the same brains, we are able to survive and make a living in vastly different environments, ranging from tropical rainforests to the Arctic, and from very small-scale villages to mega cities. And importantly, we don't owe this immense adaptability only to our individual intelligence, right? But so humans rarely adapt to changing and uncertain environments on their own. But our way of adaptation is deeply collective and social. And that goes from more short-term cooperation and coordination to longer-term cultural processes. And as many of you, or almost all of you will know, the collective dynamics really emerge from many individual level decisions. And one of the key drivers of outcomes in any collective systems is how the agents in the system mechanistically integrate different sources of information. So people often have information, like prior information about the environment, they experience the environment, they gain knowledge about it, but then they can also see what others are doing. They can learn from others, they can have different sources of social information, they can see payoffs, they can see where others are, and how people integrate these different sources of information will strongly determine how a collective will respond to a changing environment. So usually psychologists or cognitive scientists study such questions in very simplified scenarios like this from my own PhD work. So people here must repeatedly choose between different options, here different crops to plant, and they have access to different sources of information. So the crop choices of others, their experience levels, for example, and their own payoffs. And then using such control paradigms, we can then design computational models, we can write probability expressions for the different choices people can make, and then can try to understand how people weigh different sources of information and how that influences individual and a group level performance. However, decision-making in the real world is not like that. I mean, we all know this. So in real-world scenarios, people like LeBron James here on the right must continuously integrate with different sources of information and make decisions on many different time scales, right? And what's very important is that where LeBron in this case is, and where he goes and what he's done before really determines what information is available to the decision maker and what potential actions he can do. And this means environments in the real world, they are really endogenous, so they really depend on people's own actions and the actions of others. And if we want to understand like decision making and collective dynamics in the real world, we need to take that into account, that like the social environment and also the physical environment people experience are a function of their prior actions. And in this talk, I will speak about a simplified paradigm where we can study decision-making or collective decision-making in a more naturalistic way. So we'll talk about a collective foraging as a way to study cognition in more unconstrained groups. So foraging, I don't need to explain to biologists, but psychologists often don't even know this word, which is quite telling. It just means finding and collecting resources in complex environments, like these small agents here, looking for those gray resource patches. And what's really cool about foraging is that it, on the one hand, methodologically, it unites many different cognitive and social challenges. So agents need to navigate, they need to plan, they need to learn about the environment. Yeah, so there are a lot of individual but social challenges that that are present in this system. But also in the real world, foraging, and especially collective foraging, has been described by anthropologists as one of the key abilities that allowed humans to spread out of Africa and live in such vastly different environments. Here from Aboriginal Africa, Australia, to the Hadza in Tanzania, and Finns on frozen lakes that we will return to later. So today I will describe a line of projects from a postdoc project at SciOI and the MPI for Human Development that go from agent-based simulations to immersive reality experiments to collective foraging in the wild. And with this increasing naturalism, we of course also lose more and more control. So in the ABM, we can directly control the cognition of agents and the environment, and then study how both jointly affect the collective dynamics. In the immersive reality experiments, we can still control the environment, but we cannot control the cognition. So we need to find computational tools to understand the cognition and then predict the collective dynamics. And finally, in this real-world context, we have maximum ecological validity, so it's a real-world example, but we can neither control the environment nor the cognition of the agents. And as you will see in the rest of the talk, that just poses a lot of challenges, but also unique opportunities. We'll briefly start with simulations, together with PhD student David Messet, who is also co-supervised by Heiko in the back. We developed this mechanistic and spatially explicit agent-based simulation framework. So in this model, agents can be in one of 3 different states. They can individually explore the environment, which is indicated by in blue, which just means that they follow a random walk and just look for resource patches themselves. They can socially relocate, which means they had visual information about successful others in their field of view, and then they decide, okay, now I go there, and they can exploit patches. And what's quite new in this framework is that agents switch between those states, not based on some probabilistic rules, but they really have 2 mechanistic integrator neurons, which continuously accumulate evidence over time, which makes them switch from one state to the other once a certain threshold is passed. So the social integrator, for example, collects visual information in the agent's field of view and then switches to the social state once there has been enough, like a good social information in the field of view. And with a single parameter, here this epsilon w, we can thus control how strong the agents respond to social information in the field of view, and thereby really control the collective dynamics. And you can already tell here that there is often some optimum, some intermediate optimum for the responsiveness to social information. So on the left, they don't respond to others at all, which means that they forgo the adaptive benefits of social information. Everyone needs to find patches on their own. And on the right, they essentially only move as a swarm. So as soon as someone found something, you can see it, then everyone goes there, and which limits exploration of the environment. So there's really this collective exploration trade-off, which is then mediating how agents should respond to social information. And so we find that indeed high rates of social information are adaptive in environments where resources are concentrated in few but very rich patches, whereas more individualistic search is adaptive in environments with many but poorer patches. So the structure of the environment here shapes the adaptive benefits of the use of social information. This result is not new. There are many old papers essentially showing the same. But we reproduce it in this bottom-up way with this evidence accumulation framework. And then in the paper, we do a lot of different stuff. So we look at, we introduce more physical constraints, like different field of use, occlusion, physical collision between agents. That should really bridge the gap towards the robotics applications. So for example, here, just as one example, we see that often intermediate field of views are also adaptive. So essentially the physical constraint of the field of view then introduces a selective social learning in the agents, which makes them collectively better. And David, together with Heiko, then also implement this whole thing in a collective robotics framework. I'm always just very astonished how cool this looks, but I don't actually have an idea. So if you have questions about this, I can relegate you to Heiko in the back. But the aim is really to then also bring this agent-based simulation framework into the real world in this robotics platform. So what I know more about are those immersive reality experiments. So to test those predictions, we designed novel computer game experiments. In this case, people are instructed to find coins that are hidden underground with a metal detector. And as in the simulation, people could just walk around and explore the environment on their own, but they could also see if someone else discovered a resource patch, and that was shown with a digging animation, and then they can decide to learn socially and join the patch. So here you can see that the player first walks around and explores independently, but then they see this other person here being successful and decide to join. But luckily enough, they find their own patch, and they can start extracting the coins. Yeah, so in this experiment, we used a simple 2x2 design. As in the simulations, we manipulated the structure of the environments. So the same number of coins could either be concentrated in a few but rich patches, or it could be distributed among many but poorer patches. And then moreover, we also manipulated the incentives. So participants could either be incentivized on the group level and paid according to the total number of coins collected by the whole group, or they could be incentivized on the individual level according to their own payoff. And here are some behavioral results. So as predicted by the simulations, the behavioral results showed that people relied more on social information and joined more patches in the concentrated compared to the distributed one. So you can see that there are very different ranges on the x-axis. And on the individual level, the social information use also proved adaptive in concentrated but not in the distributed environment. So in the concentrated environments where there were rich resource patches, it was adaptive on the individual level to join a lot of others. It's essentially a scrounging behavior, right? If the patches are rich and someone else has found it, you can save yourself the cost of exploring independently and just join others and take away their coins, essentially. But we didn't phrase it like that, so it was perfectly neutral, right? And it was perfectly valid to do that. And yeah, but we found this really stark contrast between individual and collective success. So groups perform better in both environments, both concentrated and distributed, if on average fewer players exploited a given patch. So this means there was this conflict of interests between individual level interests, where high levels of social information use was good, and group level interests where low levels of social information use was good. And in fact, then placing the incentives on the group level actually reduced the joining propensities of players, and thereby increased the performance. So that was like the main finding, that like collective incentives reduce this scrounging social information use and thereby boost collective performance. But these results, I mean, they were interesting, but we haven't really made use of the immense richness of the data, which look more like this. So I was always fascinated by how like also unique those trajectories are. I think it's almost like fingerprints. I think someone should, throw some machine learning algorithms on this and try to identify, some personality traits or something. I feel like there is a lot in there. So to make sense of this complex time series data, we developed a hidden Markov model framework that simultaneously infers latent behavioral states, so individual exploration of the environment versus social information use, and then explains the transition probabilities between the states. And that's all happening in the same model, right? So we have noisy behavioral data, we have the different indicators, like how straight are they moving, how often are they turning, stuff like that. And from that, we want to extract a latent state, like what has the agent decided to do? Are they searching independently or using social information? So essentially, we're trying to identify those points where there is some change in the behavior. And we want to do this probabilistically, right? Because we don't really know. We don't have access to the latent states. So often you would just apply some sort of threshold rule and just say, whenever it goes, the turning rate is like that, we just categorize it as A or B. But in this work, we really try to model it probabilistically and then also propagate forward this uncertainty in the prediction of the switching probabilities. So essentially you have these hidden states, and they are assumed to emit different state-dependent variables, and we try to predict like the transitions between the states. And of course, because it's an experiment, we have a lot of information available, so we know exactly what each person saw at each point in time. And so we can use information from the visual field, like how far is the patch away that you observe, how many people do you see on the patch, to predict those transition probabilities, especially the probability to switch from like individually exploring to like socially learning. And I give you just a very brief overview of the results here. So averaging over all the situations where people observed others exploiting, participants were more likely to also switch to the social state in concentrated than in distributed, which makes sense, right? And as in the behavioral results, we observed this contrast between individual and collective success. So we plot here like the random effects from the model for each individual against their success, and you can see that individuals, like on the individual level, they benefited from higher switching rates, but groups benefited from lower switching rates. And so this really nicely mirrors the behavioral results, but on the level of this latent switching probabilities. And again, placing the incentives on the collective level here reduced the switching probabilities, and then, as we saw before, improved the collective success. In the paper, we also look deeper at the spatio-temporal collective dynamics that emerge. So this is actually the worst group in the whole experiment. And you can already see this explore-exploit trade-off, right? So once they found a patch, they're really fast in exploiting it. But because they're so close together all the time, that they're just long periods where no one, then they were very unlucky here. But they're very long periods where they're not finding anything. It's actually, so poor people. yeah, so you can, I mean, as you could already tell from this animation, in the concentrated environments, there is essentially this collective trade-off. So at shorter time scales, it benefits to be close together, because if someone finds something and everyone is close together, then they can collectively come together and exploit the resource. But over longer time scales, then it's more beneficial to stay farther apart, right? Because that increases the probability that the group as a whole finds new patches, and which then increases like success later on. Yeah, so the collective somehow needs to navigate this trade-off between like explore and exploit. And yeah, but that only holds for the concentrated environments where there are rich patches. In the distributed one, it doesn't matter. In the distributed, it was always better to search independently, also on a collective level, because yeah, there was just not enough like a potential for the use of such information. Yeah, I want to talk about one other immersive reality experiment before we go on to the real world setting. And so in this experiment, the environment was still quite simple, right? We had this static patches. They were unobservable to humans, but they were just there, and they were just sitting there, and then people just had to find them. And in the follow-up experiment led by master's and now PhD student Valery Kirchhoff, we wanted to first take those studies into like online environment. So the first one was conducted in the lab, but we wanted to try if we also can do this interactive immersive reality experiments online, but then also with the moving resource. So the aim here was to walk through this Mars crater environment and find some hidden resource that's moving underground. It's essentially like a collective tracking experiment, and you can tell from the sensor that you're holding how far you are. So now we found the resource, and now we reach the center. So this 40 means like you get 40 points per second, and it essentially tells you how close you are to the center of the resource. Then from like a top-down perspective, it looks like this. So the blue thing is the resource moving, and then the agent tries to follow that. As you will see later in the experiment, we manipulated the speed of the resource to essentially manipulate the difficulty of the task. So the resource could either move at, I think, 40% of the speed of the agents or 80% of the speed of the agents. And of course, because we're interested in collective behavior, we don't just have one person looking for these weird hidden resource that we don't really explain what it is, but we have whole groups of agents, and and that of course gives rise to like a very rich behavioral dynamics. Yeah, and you can already imagine that you need to just integrate a lot of different sources of information, right? You have this meter in your hand, and you should respond to this adaptively. But then you can also see others, but you don't really know who is a good tracker, and you don't really know what's going on. Yeah, so there is also social information provides a lot of benefits, but it can also just be very harmful. And to essentially look how much information is necessary for like a collective intelligence to emerge, we put people in different conditions. So we had first as a baseline just an alone condition where people are searching on their own. We had a so-called no signaling condition where people are in groups of 5, but they couldn't access others' payoff information, so they had no idea whether they were on the resource, how close they were to the center. Then we had this all signaling condition where people could always see how well others were doing. So it's essentially this thing, right, where you can, where like the payoff for others is indicated by this color, which corresponds to the color here. So like this person has a similar payoff, but the two of them, they're much better. And then as an intermediate condition, we had this voluntary signaling, which was inspired, a bit by also like the collective sensing literature on fish and stuff, like where we tried, where we want to see like when people can control this, will they actively share social information or costly information with others to maybe then like benefit themselves in the long run? Yeah, and if we look at the performance in this experiment, we can differentiate essentially between two different components here. So we have the tracking time on the x-axis, which is essentially just a proportion of total time that they were on the resource, right? There's this resource and you could be on it or not on it. And then orthogonal to it, there is this point collection rate, which is the amount of points you collect while you are on the resource. So this corresponds more to just the ability to just find the resource and stay on it. And then this really corresponds to a more fine-grained process of tracking the center of the resource based on different like information coming in. And as I said, we compare two different resource conditions, a slow one and a fast one. So these are the results for the slow condition. And there we can see that all social conditions here are better than the alone condition. So this looks quite good, like groups outperform individuals. And this seems to be only due to the search time, the tracking time essentially. So while they are on the resource, people in groups are not necessarily better in tracking the center, but they are just less likely to lose the resource at all, right? Because you can just go where others are. The resource is slow, so they're likely to have adaptive information. And so you could just track the general region of where the resource is quite well through others. But like people in all signaling, they were much better, and they also seem to be quite better at the actual tracking of the center than the alone participants. The results look quite different for the fast resources. So of course, everyone was worse, right? Because it was just moving much faster. It was much harder to keep track of it. But the relative differences between the conditions were quite interesting. So here, actually being in a group was worse than being alone. And that was only remedied if you also had payoff information available. So here we really have this like nice contrast that like being a group was bad, most likely because it somehow hindered their processing of the personal information, as we will see later. And only if you had this additional information about the payoffs of others constantly available, groups could somehow make up for that and improve their behavior. Yeah, now I just want to give you like, so this is still work in progress, but I want to give you like some glimpses of how we think groups are managing this. So we first looked at some very basic like network measures, and we could essentially see that like the more social information is available, so in all signaling versus voluntary signaling versus no signaling, there's just overall more connectivity between people, right? Which makes sense because like there's more social information available, so you should look more at others and hope to obtain some useful information. But what's quite cool is that in the all signaling like the social information flow, the visual information flow is also more adaptive. So imagine all scenarios where there is someone in the environment that has a better position than you. And then we plot here the probability that this person or these people are actually in your field of view. So this essentially indicates like how adaptive social information is flowing through visual connection. So how often are like better people looked at by like worse people. And you can see that then the all signaling condition, like this is really increased. So there, like this payoff information really organizes the visual connections between people in an adaptive way. And then we also looked at like a more dynamic picture of this, which is essentially the same data, but in a more dynamic way. So we look at all situations where no one is on the resource, then there is this one discoverer who first gets on the resource, and then we look at like how the visual connections between people develop. And here we can see like the in degree for this discoverer, and you see that only in the all signaling it really shoots up. So people are not able without payoff information to tell that something has changed. So there has been some recent papers also arguing that people can do this rich social inference, that they can somehow tell based on the behavior of others, how they're turning, that people can actually infer how well they're doing. But at least in this more complex environment, it was not possible, which is indicated by this really flat line. So people had no idea when others got on the resource, just based on the behavior alone. And then what's quite interesting is that over time, in alt signaling, it led to a higher recruitment of others. So the probability of other players on the resource also dramatically increased. And that over time even helped the discoverers themselves. And this is something we will look into more deeply. So the idea is essentially that you, as a discoverer, you find the resource. Then through the signal, you recruit others to join you. And so you recruit yourself useful social information that will help you stay on the resource for longer. At least this is our interpretation for now, but yeah, we'll look into this in more detail. But then to really understand how they're using this wealth of social information or different information sources available, we also developed a simple computational model where we try to predict how much people are turning depending on different information sources. And just very briefly, there are a lot of estimates. I don't want to go through all of them. But what we can see here, for example, is that people in all group conditions actually respond less to their meter value. And this is, of course, not a very good idea because this is the direct information about the environment. And Valerie also calculated how they should optimally respond to this. So if you're an optimal agent, this detector is all you need, and you can respond to this optimally. But people in groups, they seem to be distracted from this information because there's so much else going on in the visual field, so they're not tracking their own environment as accurately, which seems to be a bad idea in general. But then the signal or the payoff information that's available also really influences how people are responding to others. So they're using more social information in general, so both the position of others, but also the movement direction of others, that they're aligning with the movement direction of others in the alt signaling condition. But what's maybe most interesting is that only in the alt signaling, this is really on a success or quality dependent way. So only in the alt signaling condition, they adjust their social information use based on the quality of the social information. And that seems to be what's really required then to make up for this a distraction or from the less detailed processing of the personal information. And so, yeah, maybe just one detail that I find quite cool is that in the slow resource environment, there still seems to be a small effect here, even if there is no payoff information available. So if the resource is very slow, there seems to be some social inference going on that you're able to at least somehow tell who is doing well or not. But in the fast condition, this is really not possible anymore. And then as a very last step here, we or I should say, in this case, definitely only Valerie, to develop this agent-based simulation where we really try to see if we simulate agents in a bottom-up way and we manipulate their social information selectivity, so how strongly they adjust the social information use based on success, how does that influence payoffs. So essentially, so here you can see the social information quality, so how much better is someone else in the field of view compared to yourself, and on the y-s then the probability to use social information versus learn individually. And so you can see, so the yellow one is a very steep curve, which means that you're highly selective, and the purple one is really flat, so you don't pay attention at all to how good others are. And then, so we simulated agents, and then we compared the performance of social agents to alone agents, just to see like under which conditions can collectives actually be better. And in this case, we plot also different environments. And so these x's here correspond to our slow environment, and the crosses here correspond to our fast environment. But we also plot some other scenarios. And you can see that a lot of the points are right of like this line here. So being in a group often improved like the tracking time or the overall time you stay in the resource. This is also what we saw in the behavioral results, right? That like being in a group often helped just staying in the resource in general. But there's but there are very few conditions where being in a group actually increased your tracking abilities. And we were actually super lucky because we somehow, I mean, we didn't simulate that from the beginning, but we actually just essentially by chance discovered this very nice region in parameter space where people in groups could actually be better in tracking, but only if they are very selective. So you can see the colors here, they correspond to those colors. So only if you can adjust your social information use to the quality, and only in specific environments, people in groups could actually do better. And so, yeah, this corresponds like quite nicely to our behavioral results, where only in slow condition, so in those lines essentially, people in all signaling could also be slightly better in the actual tracking, so in the point collection rate compared to the solar ones. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. Sorry. So I hope it's not too fast. But I want to get to the ice fishing, to the real world stuff. But I just want to briefly mention also this like other nice experiment that we're doing together with Lisa, Ahmed, and Jacob, who is also in the room, where we go the other way again and try a more simplified version of a foraging scenario where people can just switch back and forth between two lakes, but then we really try to get a more mechanistic understanding of the decision making and really fit more cognitive computational models to the decisions of agents. So Lisa, for example, has developed this really nice, like based on the evidence accumulation framework that Jacob and Ahmed have developed, has devised a really nice model to social patch foraging, to see how people integrate social information into their decision making. And then we are doing the same from a reinforcement learning perspective. And this is still very much work in progress, but at least we already have some models that somehow reproduce the behavioral dynamics quite well. Yeah, but just wanted to briefly mention that. But so in the rest, like in the last 10-15 minutes of the talk, I want to go to this pretty different real-world environment where we have much less experimental control, but we can observe people's behavior in a highly relevant real-world ecology. So I spoke about, like the importance of foraging for human evolution in the beginning. So over the last 2 years, we have organized 20 ice fishing competitions near Joensuu in North Karelia in Finland here. And this is really work like organized by Ralph. Like he got the grant, he really made this all happen, and led by PhD student Alex Tchaikovsky, and I was just supervising like the modeling essentially. But yeah, so during those 3-hour competitions, roughly 50 highly experienced ice fishers are incentivized to find and catch as much fish as possible. And then they bring the fish back, we weigh it, and then there are some winners of the tournament, and they get money. And so this video already gives you a pretty good scale, a pretty good overview of the immense scales of this whole thing. So the black dots there are all people, right? And but the lake is really vast. I think I will show it again. And the snow can be quite high as well. So there are also really big movement costs. Yeah, and then people, they need to drill a hole, and this is also quite intensive. And then try to probe the environment, see is there a swarm underneath, and is there fish or not. And so we equipped each individual fisher with a GPS tracker and with a head camera to obtain like high resolution data about where they are in the lake and what they see and what they do. So we categorize their behavior based on the videos into different states, so whether they were searching, whether they were drilling, or whether they were like angling. And then what's really important, we can identify each individual catch. And so Alex did this all by hand. So we tried to work together with like some computer vision people, but no one really managed to make something that is really good. So I could imagine that here, like we have some experts, because like poor Alex, he spent so many hours watching those videos. We also tried to hire some Hiwis, but there was also not like too much consistency. So yeah, so it would be great in the future if there would be some technical solutions for this. So if Alex is watching, I think he agrees. Yeah, and so we end up with, like after all this transcription, we end up with a lot of data. So here is just some very high level overview. So you can see that there is a lot of variation across the different lakes or competition sites in terms of how much fish they catch. And also within each day, there's huge variation. Like if you just look at this, like the first day here, there was this one guy, I even remember his name, and he was just super lucky, and he was insanely good on this day, and he caught all the fish. And then we thought he's the super fisher, but then the rest of the time he was not really good. So, but yeah, so there is a lot of variation both between different lakes, but also within different lakes. And how much fish they catch seems to be really driven by the proportion of patch discoveries. So patch discoveries just means like how many, like what proportions of holes you drill actually results in successful like fish catches. And so there's this very strong positive relationship between the average number of catches and the patch discoveries. So it's really, you can really see that it's like also a search problem, that it's really important for people to just discover and then track the patches. So in my mind, it's quite similar also to what I showed you before with the Mars, right? There is some hidden resource under the ground. You don't really see it. It's likely moving, and you want to find it and follow it individually and collectively. Yeah, and again, it's like a massive data set with really interesting like time series data on location of people. And then like here you can see it's just the time, like the trajectory of one person. Each of those dots is a hole they drilled. So this is also really nice about this ice fishing system, that it's continuous, but it's also somehow discrete, right? Because they need to make active choices. Now I want to stop, I want to sit down, I want to drill a hole. And so this is really nice also for the modeling, as you can see later. And so you see this trajectory, and it really also looks like an area restricted search pattern, right? Like sometimes they're successful, then they stay in the area and they search locally. But then if they're not successful, they also move like really long distances somehow. So the red dots are successful spots, and the black ones are unsuccessful spots. Yeah, and our main goal first is to predict how fishers actually decide where to drill their next hole and how they use different sources of information to do that. So here we've visualized like 4 different angling holes. So person goes from S1 to S4. And then how could we predict where this person will go next? And to do that, we actually drew on a modeling framework I developed for predicting block choices in this Minecraft environment. So there we have like different features, and we use those features to see like how people use information to make decisions about the next block destruction. And this is actually super similar also to the step selection models that are used in animal ecology quite a lot. So on the ice, we don't have this clearly defined blocks, right? So, but we still need to decide which options were available to a fisher to somehow then compute the probabilities for the different options based on different features. So we know where the fisher went, this spot S5, but what alternative options were available. So to define this option space, we then simulated alternative spots that they could have taken from each fissure's turning angle and the step length distribution. And then, as in the Minecraft experiment, we calculated different features for each of the different spots, threw them all into a softmax function, and used that to infer which features drove their spot choices. Yeah, so what features did we use? So as I said in the beginning, we're interested in how they combine like personal information, social information. So the personal information features in this case were based on their successes and failures. So these stars are spots when they were successful. And this feature essentially captures how close are alternative locations to previous successful spots. The loss feature is just the opposite. How close are they to unsuccessful spots? Then we have the social feature, which captures essentially the social density of different regions of the lake. So how close are they to other fissures? And then we also looked at this roughness feature, which is essentially, so there are these depth curves on the lake, just the topological gradient of the lake, and this was also available to people. And they say that they use that in some way, right? Because it's essentially the only information that's available to them. And they have some rich theories about how the fish respond to these depth curves. And I'm not really sure if it's based on science or based on some mythology. I think it's some combination of both, but they just say they respond like strongly to this, these depth curves. Yeah, so here are the weights of the different features, and that essentially indicates how strongly people use those different features in the decision making. The green bar is the population level fixed effects across all lakes and people. And then those black bars are the lake-specific effects. So you can see that there is quite some variation between lakes, but there is also a lot of consistency. And you can see that they used all of those features in ways that make sense, that are adaptive. So they are more likely to drill holes close to other people. They are more likely to drill holes close to the depth curves. There's a strong effect of success. So if you were successful, you're likely to drill a hole next to past successful spots. And there's the opposite pattern for losses. So you stay away from previous losses. And what's quite cool, and this also mirrors results we found in the Minecraft experiment, is that people use social information selectively. So there is this interaction between success and loss and the social weights. So they rely more on social information if they were unsuccessful. So it's really like success-based bias copying or something. Yeah. So you adjust your social information use based on your personal success. And then what's a really nice feature here is that we can also look at spatial generalization. So the way those success features and the social features are computed is that we don't hard code like how people generalize across space, but it's estimated from the model. So we essentially estimate a function that says like how strongly does information decay over space, and that tells us like how local people treat the social information. So I think it's better visualized here. So here on the x you see the distance, and then on the y the kernel density. And you see that people like generalize the social information much more than the personal information. So I think we understand this in a way that like personal information is direct information about the environment, right? So you don't believe that only because you caught something here, there's something very far away. So there's still some generalization because you might assume that there are some schools and they have some extent, right? But you don't generalize like too much. Versus social information is a less certain signal. That there are people, so there is maybe some indication that they were successful at some point, but you don't really know. So you treat that as a more like vague signal and generalize over larger areas. And then lastly, we can then actually see how well those cues actually predict success. So we look for each spot, we take the feature value, and we predict the probability of catching a fish there. And what's very striking is that like this pattern here really nicely mirrors the actual way people are using social information. So the way people are using social information and the personal information really seems to be adaptive in this environment. So social spots actually were better. With the roughness feature, it's less clear. But also like the success and the loss feature shows that there was spatial autocorrelation in the environment that people were then using. I will speed up a bit, but it's also not so much left. So we already saw from the picture that it looked very much like area-restricted search. So after a success, you travel less far and you turn more to explore the environment locally. From model simulations, we can nicely reproduce this pattern, although there's like a lot of uncertainty, whereas a random walk model doesn't produce the same pattern. And then what's also quite nice is that like social information really changes this pattern of area-restricted search. So if people are in high social density area, they remain in this local search state much longer. So even if they're unsuccessful, for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 spots, they're still in this search mode because they think, like others are here. So I mean, I just need to search, more closely. Whereas in regions with low social density, they go back to more long-range exploration of the lake again. So there is really this like social area-restricted search that's induced by the presence of others. And then lastly, we also look at temporal decision making. So at each spot, when do people leave again? Right, this is like a very long topic in foraging literature, like how people integrate their the success rates, and then when do they decide to stay or do they decide to leave? But I think I will skip over that for the sake of time. But essentially what we find is both heuristic strategies, that people seem to have this heuristic, like if there was one fish in that spot, I wait longer, but they are not really adjusting it in a more sophisticated way. They seem to have like 2 internal giving up times, one for successful spots, one for unsuccessful ones, and then they just switch back and forth. But there is also some evidence that they do like local updating, that they do essentially a Q learning or reinforcement learning on the present location, and that they also globally update the reward rate of the whole environment, which would be predicted by marginal value theorem. But the evidence is quite weak. So there is some, you can also see the posteriors are super wide, and it doesn't really improve the fit of the model too much. But there is some evidence for that. But this is all still a bit like work in progress. So to sum up, through all these different studies, we essentially propose a framework that lets us study decision-making, also cognitive processes in much more unconstrained environments, and especially in unconstrained social environments. So we're very much in line with what this cluster here is also doing, right? We can use high-resolution tracking data. But then I think what's maybe a bit different is that as we're interested in humans, we usually want to model like rich decision-making agent and a lot of cognitive processes, right? We think that like for human decisions or human collectives, we cannot just treat them as like particles and have some physical forces between them, but we need to actually represent their cognitive architecture in some way. And we think like with all this new like technology and computational modeling, it's actually possible to extract decisions from this naturalistic trajectories, and then use computational models to understand the decisions, at least like to a certain degree. And very lastly, so I'm starting my own group in Marburg now. I'm super nervous in 2 days, and I'm looking for my own like PhD student at some point. So if you have some interested master students, I haven't really put out the ad yet, but I will do that in the next weeks. But if someone comes to mind that might be interested in that sort of stuff and wants to move to this beautiful Marburg, which is actually quite similar to Konstanz in certain ways, has this nice castle, please send them my way. And with that, I want to thank all my collaborators. I want to especially thank Ralph Krivers, who is really, who was my postdoc supervisor and really made a lot of that stuff happen, but also all of the other people. And yeah, it was done as part of the Science of Intelligence cluster and the MPI for Human Development in Berlin. And thanks you for listening, and thanks Michael again, and Alex for inviting me. Thank you.
Cool, thanks a lot, Dominik. It looks like we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering, in your gold digging experiment, you showed that different people have different strategies. Some are very systematic, others chaotic, others only go to the borders. What happens if you put them in groups specifically? So if you make groups of systematic people, groups of mixed people, groups of chaotic people, do you find an effect?
That's a very interesting question. And I think this also applies to the agent-based model I showed in the beginning. We haven't really looked into that yet. So far, we only have homogeneous groups, but I think that would be very exciting. And also, so far, we've only treated individual exploration as a correlated random walk. But we obviously see that people have this mental representation of the environment, and they explore it differently. And I think this is a very rich potential source, but we haven't really done that yet.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had the same question first, but but you had just one model, like the hidden Markov model, or maybe even not hidden, I don't remember. But so even though you have all these different strategies, actually that's part of the question. Are there different strategies? So there is one that's kind of clear, that is going through the environment. But do you think there are other strategies that you can recognize from the patterns?
Mm-hmm. So in the beginning, I had the hope of actually identifying different individual search states as well. But then at some point I realized there's so much diversity, and I'm not so much interested in that, but I'm more interested in the social learning. So I then devised the hidden Markov model in a way to actually only identify the social state. So essentially I said, there's a social state, I know what that looks like, and then I chose variables to reflect that, and all the individual stuff was then essentially just, a dump of other states. But I think there's a lot of heterogeneity there, and it was just not something I was focusing on so much. But I think, it would be super interesting also to see which one of these individual search states are adaptive in different environments. And I think there is also some work along these lines, right? I think Pavel Romanchuk, he also has a PhD student Patrick Gavoni, right? You know him, Heiko? Yeah, but I think he's looking into that. So I think there are some people looking into that.
Can I just a quick, do you have any information in all your experiments that humans use a head direction of other humans rather than their movement in one direction?
So in our case, that's the same. Right, so we don't, so there is no, because all in video games, it's not in VR, right? So they only see the avatars of others, and there is no difference between the head and the movement direction. But I mean, so we see that they respond to the movement direction, right? But we don't differentiate between that.
I was wondering how you treat conflict. On one hand, between your information classes, so if personal and social information are conflicting each other, but also between foragers. So for example, with the fishermen, I would assume that they're not sitting within 3 meters, 5 fishers altogether. So how are you treating those occurrences?
So with the fishers, they were not allowed to be so close to each other. So there was just a rule that said, you cannot sit on the same spot, but you need to keep, I think, 5 meters distance. And I think they also, they stick to that because, they're very used to it. Yeah, I think the conflict between different information sources is very interesting, right? Because in our models, we always average across all sorts of different situations and just see like how strongly do they, but we don't really look, I think, at like how the information sources really interact depending on the situation, right? Like it could, we kind of have scenarios where they're conflicting, we have scenarios where they're not conflicting, where they're aligning, and maybe they're adjusting the dependence on the different information sources depending on those scenarios, right? But yeah, but we don't really do that, I think.
Thanks.
Thanks for the talk, Dominik. I'm wondering I think the model comparisons and the experiment comparisons are really nice, of course. That's like the project we're working on together. With these comparisons you showed of the model, in particular, there seemed to be there's an optimal in the social information use, balancing the explore and exploit. From the experiments and kind of taking the overall view, can you make any general conclusions of like the human experiments tended to overuse social information, underuse, or if it was depending on the environment, or was it close to optimality in comparing this with the experiments or with the simulations?
It's a very good question. So I think the problem with the direct comparison between the simulation and the experiment is that the individual search is so different. So we were actually planning to do this, right? But the problem is that like the humans, they searched so much more efficiently, like on an individual level, that it really shifted the optimality of social information use. So for the artificial agents, because they were so stupid individually, and social information was the only adaptive force, it was good to use a lot of social information. But for the humans, because they have this rich mental map of the environment and their much smaller amounts of social information were actually adaptive. But I think, we essentially picked like 2 regions of the environment, right? And just thought in this region, it should be more or less adaptive. In this region, it should be not adaptive. But we don't really have all the stuff in between, right? So I think that's what would be necessary to show like there is an intermediate, right? Because we just have one where it's adaptive and one where it's not adaptive. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dominik, for this fascinating talk, and thank you so much for coming today, and best of success for the new faculty position. Congratulations again. And thank you all for coming today, and hopefully see you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you.